Hey everybody, my name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com to make an important point. Basically the trade-off between systemic risk and economies of scale. Because a lot of times you'll hear people who advocate for government control or government provision of things trying to make an economies of scale argument, saying, well, right now you have so many different businesses providing the same thing and there's a lot of redundancy having different businesses doing the same thing. Wouldn't there be economies of scale if the government was the only one who did it? So that way you're not paying for 2 billing departments and you're not paying for twice the marketing budget. You're just having one entity doing it, and all that savings can be passed on to the consumer. Okay, so they'll make this economies of scale argument and say basically the government's more efficient, so that'd be better. Basically trying to argue against the market. But again, efficiency shouldn't be your only consideration. And then also there's also the whole fact of force and having you basically for the government to provide anything and be the sole provider of something that would require you to force other people to not provide it. And that in itself basically creates moral issues as far as forcing people. But let's just keep this economic. Is efficiency the only thing the market prices in? No. Okay, there's a beauty in redundancy. Okay, in the sense that basically multiple businesses mean one business fails, there's still an alternative provider. Okay, but now while redundancy is inefficient, what's the right level of redundancy? That's what the market determines. Okay, how many businesses, how many copies of the same kind of business do you really need? And if there's too many, what's going to happen is that some of them are not going to be profitable and they're going to shut down. Okay, so when there's too much redundancy, too much inefficiency, the market prices it out. When there's too little, well, there's going to be huge profits that's going to encourage other people to enter the business. And the other beauty of that redundancy is the competition aspect, where those competing companies have the ability to compete based on price, which keeps prices lower. So you may have redundancy, but there's pressure on them to keep those redundancies, those inefficiencies to a minimum, so that way they can compete against each other. And two, they have pressure to innovate against each other. Okay, so that's a couple of things. But also there's the idea of systemic risk. If the government's the only provider, something happens to the government, then everybody no longer gets that thing. If the government's the only provider of healthcare, government collapses, no one has healthcare anymore. Government's the only provider of education, government collapses, no one can get education anymore because there isn't an alternative. You're screwed, you have systemic risk. So this comes up where someone brought up the deregulation in electricity that occurred in the 70s under Carter. And they were arguing that basically before energy was deregulated, that the government was basically forcing companies, or government was in a position where it could force energy companies to update their technology, and that maybe we would have more efficiency today and our energy would be cheaper. And my argument against that is like that may be the case. If you allowed government to force these energy companies, maybe they would be more efficient. Maybe our energy would be cheaper. But that's all part of a centralized energy grid. So basically, if government got involved and did force those efficiencies, they would basically be creating an incentive for people to only have their energy from this centralized energy grid, creating a systemic risk. Because again, if something happens to that energy grid, we're all screwed. But so my thing is, the deregulation was still a good thing, because even if it made that energy grid less efficient, it made the difference between going off the grid, so maybe investing in getting solar panels for your house, maybe investing in a generator, investing in an alternative in case something happens, more advantageous. Because again, if going through the centralized energy grid was so cheap that there's no reason to have an alternative other than, once in a while there's a brownout or a blackout or something like that. And then again, if you had a more efficient grid, maybe there'd be less brownouts and blackouts, and that means people would be less prepared when there is a systemic crash, because people won't be buying those generators or solar panels. So sometimes inefficiency, natural market inefficiencies, are a good thing because they create incentives for individuals to invest in alternatives individually and be prepared as an individual for when systemic situations happen. So the fact that bad things never happening because of X policy is still not necessarily a good thing, because if bad things never happen, then people never prepare. And inevitably there will be a bad thing. Okay? So again, there's a trade-off between efficiency and systemic risk. So generally, again, getting those economies of scale, getting those efficiencies may lead there to be more systemic risk. But with the market, you allow the market to determine the balance between efficiency and systemic risk, meaning, the lack of alternatives for the sake of economies of scale versus redundancy to a benefit. You allow kind of society to decide those things without forcing anybody to do anything. Okay, so that's my take on that. So again, efficiency is not, something being more efficient is not always a sufficient argument for something. And we need to recognize the trade-offs in every possibility and recognize that the market does price in all these trade-offs, even if individual consumers are not necessarily always thinking about them all the time. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. Check out my other videos, like me on social media. Thank you very much.